Right now you should be looking at the blank screen. If you start SPSS, you'll see something like this. At times it'll ask you if you want to open up a new folder or a new file or a new project. Just cancel out of that, ignore that, and just get to yourself to a screen that looks a little bit like this. Blank, no information on it. Now, your version of SPSS that you might be using may be different than the one I'm going to use in this tutorial, and I don't want you to worry about that. Because at the end of the day, for many of the commands that we're going to be using in SPSS at this level, regardless of the version you're using, the way that we find the commands and the way that we actually complete the commands are going to be almost identical. And if you do find that as different versions maybe have different commands or something doesn't seem to line up the way we've covered it, let me know, reach out to me, and I'll be happy to talk to you about where it is you want to be to get to the work or get the process completed that you intend to. Now, there's a couple things I want to highlight here, even though we're just dealing with the blank information, which is I want to start off by pointing out a couple of things. Now, if you've used other spreadsheet software, like maybe something like Microsoft Excel or even Microsoft Access or Lotus, any one of a number of different database file programs, you're going to be familiar with the setup here. But if you're not, or you haven't used those before, then there's a couple of things I really want to highlight about working with a program like SPSS. Now, you're going to have columns going across the top, and these are going to be representing our variables in our data. And you're going to have rows, of course, going across down the side, and these are going to represent different cases. So for each case, we will have a series of variables that correspond to it. And the way I want you to think about this, one of the easiest ways I think to think about this, is that each case is going to represent a person. And each case will have different characteristics of that person that we record. So for example, we might be interested in variables like sex, might be interested in variables like race, age, income, ethnicity, political affiliation, religious affiliation. And each one of these columns can represent one of those variables separately. And again, it's going to be for each person individually as we go down. And as we work with the data and we look at some examples, this will make a little bit more sense. Now, I want you to focus down here on the bottom left-hand side with me for just a moment. And you can see here we have something called data view and we have something called variable view. Now, currently, the default is usually going to be for you to be in data view. Now, again, if you have different versions of SPSS or if someone closed it with settings saved, you may end up in the variable view. And if that happens, it's not really a problem. But what we can do is we can actually click down here in the bottom left on where it says variable view. Now, not much has changed here. Ultimately, we still have a blank screen. But that's in part because we still have no information, no data opened up in this for this example. But you're going to see that columns have changed. And what's actually happened is now each one of these rows here is no longer going to represent a different case, but it's actually going to represent each of the variables that we're looking at. So in some ways, what was the horizontal axis on the data view has now become the vertical axis in the variable view. And again, this is going to make more sense when we actually look at some data. But for the moment, I just want us to familiarize ourselves with this setup. Now, one other thing I want to highlight here is that in this area that you're looking at, whether it's the data view or the variable view, it's only going to have your data in there. So as we start running analyses, as we start using the software program to actually calculate out or to look at things, we're actually going to end up with a separate file being opened as a screen. And that's going to be what we refer to as our output file. And we'll see an example of that in just a moment. But for the first example, what I'd really like us to do is take a couple of minutes to look at how we can actually open data in a program like SPSS. And we're going to see that there are a lot of different ways we can do this, and in part, we'll find that SPSS is actually very flexible in terms of its ability to open up some different types of data files. Obviously, there are SPSS files that I can open, but we'll also see that I can open things like Microsoft Excel files, you can open text files. If you use a different statistical software program, and there are a number of them, programs like SAS or Stata, those programs have their own data files, but they can be opened up here in SPSS as well. So for today, what I want us to focus on is just getting to the point where we can start looking at data. So if you see up here in the top left, you have an option, and like many Microsoft programs, called simply file. And a lot of this should be familiar to you, particularly if you use programs like Microsoft Office. You can see you've got new, open. Now obviously open database is a little bit different, but for the moment I really just want us to focus in on those top two options, new and then open. Now new is going to basically give us a blank screen, much like the one we already have. And if we follow that, I'm just going to click this through for the example. Let's go to new and then to data. You're going to see we end up with a new screen. Now, you might think it's the old screen, but if you look up here in the top left, it's now called Untitled 2 Dataset 1. So this is a different screen. And if we go down, we can actually see now that the option that we have, we're calling this Dataset 2. Now, notice as well, what's happened is we now have a file called Output 1. And as I said to you before, this is going to be where most of our information is going to come from. And you can see, in fact, it starts off now saying new file, dataset name, dataset 1, window equals front. These are all just a record of the commands that SPSS is running. Now, when SPSS was first created, it was a text-driven software program. And right around version 6 or 7 or so, they started to have drop-down commands. And with that in mind, we can now see that the program's a bit easier to work with, but it's still built on a structure of this syntax, like most programs are going to be. And so what the program does is it reports that syntax out for us for record-keeping purposes. And also, you know, sometimes we work on something, we come back to it, it's been a while. We can actually find that the output will list out the commands of exactly what we did for easy referral, so we can take advantage of that. Now, normally I would say with something like this, I'll close it. But the truth is I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to minimize it. And the reason is that, yeah, I could close it. I could cancel it out. I could tell it not to save it. But all it's going to do is the very next time I click a series of commands, it's going to open it up again. So for the moment, let's just minimize it. And I want to go back to that file command. Now this time, instead of going to file new, I'm going to go to file open. And you can actually see you've got 4 different options here. And now we're not going to deal with many of them, but I want to touch very briefly on them. So the first one is simply file open data. There's file open syntax, file open output, and then file open script. Now, for those people who were familiar with working with SPSS prior to drop-down commands, syntax was how we recorded those commands. And like I said to you a moment ago, that output file, that's the SPSS syntax is sort of kicking that back out to you. The two we're most interested in focusing on is going to be open data and then open output. And the truth is, for the moment, we don't really care about opening the output. We have an output file open. There's just nothing in it. So let's instead go to open then data. Now, what I've actually done is put a folder on my desktop with a couple examples of data. Now the first one here, you can see I have a file called General Social Survey Subset 2016.sav. SAV, if you look down here, is the default SPSS file. Now it's not the only type of file that SPSS is going to open. And in fact, if you click where it says files of type, you can see that there's sort of a laundry list here. You got SPSS PC, Systat, Portable, Excel, Lotus, Silk, DBase, and then going further, SAS, data, text, and then all files. Now, one thing I do want to show you here really quickly is that you can see up here on this list, there's only a single file, but that's because it's only showing the files of the file type that have been specified. If I go down here and I go to all files, you can actually see there's a second file in that directory that I've put there called 2017ucr.xls. And if you're familiar with Excel, you know that means this is an Excel file. And we're going to look at both of these and see what it looks like to import that type of file in. But for the moment, let's instead just go to the social survey subset file. I'm going to highlight it and I'm going to just say open. Now, your screen may look a little bit different than this. You may not see text. You may instead see a series of numeric values. I've actually purposefully had the program put it up this way to throw you a little bit off, or in reality, if you run into a situation where this happens, you're going to know how to respond to it. Now, the way SPSS works, like most software programs that are going to collect numeric-based data, is it's not really going to keep information in a syntax form here. So you can see, for example, words like, obviously this variable is going to be marital status. You've got married, separated, DK representing don't know. The next column you've got white, you've got black, you've got other. Next column you have male, female. Now, the truth of the matter is we never actually report data this way. We never enter data like this. Because every time we enter data, every time we enter a row of data, every time we enter a case of data, we recognize the fact that there's always going to be a small chance that we're going to make errors. And the more complicated the data, the more information we have to enter, the more likely we're going to be to make a mistake. So the truth of the matter is that while you're looking at this text in front of you, this was not what was entered as the data. Instead, what you're looking at are the labels associated with that data. So we'll come to that in just a moment. But what I'd like to do first of all is I'd simply like you to go up to where it says View. And then you can see about partway down you have two boxes that are checked. One's called Grid Lines and one's called Value Labels. What Value Labels is what you're looking at on the screen right now. That white, black, and other, that male, that female, separated and divorced, they're all labels. They're not the actual data. And if I click this off, you can see what happens. What you actually have is numeric data underlying this. This is what was entered. And it was entered this way because it's much less likely that someone's going to make a data entry error entering a 1 than they are in typing in the name or the word male or female or separated or widowed or divorced. So instead, a series of numeric codes have been assigned to each of those possible values. Now, how do we know how that works? Well, in this view, which is the data view, we're simply looking at the data. If, however, we go back down here to the variable view, and as we said before, with the variable view, each of those columns, which were variables, now become rows of information for us. So you can see here at the very first row is named age. And I'm going to jump back for just a second here. And that makes perfect sense. You've got a score of 47, 61, 72. These make sense in terms of age values. Going back to the variable view, you can see that it was recorded numerically. The width in terms of how wide or how many characters were allowed to be entered is 2. Decimal places is 0. We don't really deal with decimals in terms of age. Now you can see the label here, which is actually telling us specifically what the variable is. Now it's got cut off, and that's because, again, just the default of the program is it only allows so many characters to be visible. But we can look at the whole thing. So if you take your mouse and you click right up here between the word label and values, if you get that border, click, hold it, and drag it to the right, we can make it wide enough to actually see. So we've got now age of respondent, marital status of first person, and so on down. Now, before, when we were looking at the words, we were able to turn that off and look at the numeric values. And then we said that those were the value labels. Well, the next column is referred to as values. And so if we think about what we had before for race, which was male or female, was white, black, or other. If we actually click on those values, you can see that we have white, black, and other. Now, you can also notice, and this is going to happen with a lot of the other variables as well, that sometimes there's a fourth or an additional label associated with it. And these can stand for a lot of different things. It could stand for don't know response. It could represent when a question actually wasn't asked of all of the participants, because there's a difference between someone not answering a question versus not being asked the question. And so a lot of times you're going to see these other sort of characters show up. And I don't want you to worry about those right now because we don't really treat those as valid responses. So you can see here again in this variable of race, if we have a value of 0, which is associated with IAP. Now, if I cancel out of this, or I can say OK, because I haven't changed anything, I'm just going to cancel though. You can see that the next column is called missing. And what missing actually tells the program is that if there is a specific value entered here, in this case, the value is 0, then this is not a question, or rather, this is not a case to include in the analysis. In other words, treat it as missing. Don't include it in our analyses that we're going to conduct. So for this example, that IAP is going to be associated with a missing value. We're not going to include it. If you go down here to say the example, should marijuana be made legal, you can actually see 3 different characters are now being represented in this missing column. 0, 8, and 9. Now if I take a look, I can see that IAP is a 0, 8 is representing don't know, and then 9 is representing not applicable. So that's where that 0, 8, and 9 is coming from. These are values that we don't want to include in any type of statistical analysis because they're not going to help us understand the pattern of our data any better. Now the rest of them are less important. Columns is simply the number of columns wide that the column is in the variable view. So for example, you can see that all of them here are 8. If I go back to the data view, you can see that all of the columns are the same width. If I were to turn around and to raise that column number for the first one for age to about 16, and I go back to the data view, it's twice as wide. Why is that important? Well, in most cases, it's not very important. It's just simply a way for us to be able to look at our data a little bit more cleanly. And if we save the file, it saves whatever values are there. So we can decide that some variables are going to be a little bit wider, much more useful if we've got some text responses in there, and some can be made a little bit thinner. Alignment is simply what side of the screen each of the cells are going to be aligned to. Measurement, what's the level of measurement of the variable. People can get very much hung up on this. Generally speaking, we don't have to do too much with this. The program doesn't really restrict us from being able to do certain analyses because of that measure, but for those who are completists or for those who find it easier, you can go through and change that associated measure label. And then finally, role is something we don't have to worry about in regards to the work that we're going to be doing since our data sets are already going to be completed for examples like this. So let's go back over the data view here for a moment. And we can take a look again at those different variables that we've got. Now, the data here is from the General Social Survey. It's a subset of the data. General Social Survey is actually hundreds of variables. This is only about 10 or 12 that I've pulled out because I thought they would be interesting to take a look at. Now, one of the nice things about this is that many of these variables are very easy for us to understand. Marital status, race, sex, we've got happiness, health, we've got whether or not people believe marijuana should be legalized, whether or not folks own a gun. A lot of different variables that tie in with a lot of different potentially interesting topics that we might want to think about. Now, we're going to talk in future sessions about where we can necessarily go from here. Our next step is going to really be starting to think a little bit about univariate statistics, some of the preliminary work that we can do. And one of the things it's going to be important for us to consider is that using something like the GSS here, and I'm just going to go over here to the right, and I'm going to highlight and scroll this all the way down. You can actually see we've got about 2,867 different responses to the survey. So again, I was saying think of each row in the data view as a person, and that's exactly what they are in this case. The survey was completed by 2,867 people in 2016. Now, not all of them answered every single question, which is why you got a lot of those don't know or not applicables, but many of them answered many of those questions. Now, there are going to be easier ways to move forward with this instead of sort of scrolling down like that. But there's actually something else I want to show you. One of the things that many of you should be thinking about in the future is how you can go about conducting your own research, conducting your own analyses. And what that is going to entail in a lot of cases is you developing, coming up with, or basically generating your own data set. Now, SPSS is a fantastic program for data sets that have already been completed. On the other hand, if we're going to create our own data set, SPSS might not be the best way to handle it. And in fact, one of the better ways I've always found to think about it is to work in Excel, which gives you a lot more control, it gives you some flexibility, and maybe most importantly, towards the end, it's actually very easy to import that into a program like SPSS. So what I actually like to do is go up to the File command again. I'm going to go to Open. I'm going to go to Data. And it's going to take us right back to the data file that we had, or data folder that we had opened before. Now this time, instead of saying SPSS statistics as the file type, I'm going to specifically tell it Excel. And now we end up with one file here, 2017 UCR data. Now this is a data file that I downloaded from the FBI's website, so this is not the raw UCR data. This is sort of a summary set. And I'm going to tell the program to open it. Now, when we used the SPSS file before, it just popped right open. With Excel, it's actually going to ask you for a little bit of information. And you can see here that right away, there's actually two different worksheets in Excel that have information on them. Now, one of these is actually the original table of data from the FBI website. And the second one is the one I did a little bit of cleaning up on for ease of demonstration. And so for now, I'm simply going to click on that. I'm not going to specify a range, and I'm just going to say OK. Now, before I do, by the way, note what happens, or what the default here is at the top. It says it's going to treat that first row as the list of the variable names. And that's going to be very helpful for us for a number of reasons. But one is simply not having to clean that up later. And I'm going to say OK. Okay, so there you've got it. The data now up on the screen is not quite as neat as what we saw before, but in some ways just as intuitive. You can see that we've got a list of variable names across the top, and there's sort of an odd one here with the V3, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second. And if we go down here to the variable view again, you can see that it's a little bit tougher to read, but let's pull this open a little bit so we can see. And I'm going to do it for both the names and the labels. And you can see that there's a little bit of an odd pattern going on. So on the left-hand side where the names are, you have things like state, area, population, violent crime. And then you've got what looks a little bit like alphabet soup, except for the fact that you can clearly see the word murder at the beginning. Well, it's actually just murder and non-negligent manslaughter, all crammed together in one word. One of the things SPSS is not going to let you have are spaces in your variable names. It also, by the way, will not let you have a number first, which is why, for example, that third variable is V3. If you tried to make it 3V, you're going to get an error message. Now, why is this? Well, simply the way the program's originally set up. It allows you to use a great number of letters to name your variables, but it's not going to let you have spaces in them. Now, there's a couple workarounds on this. A very common one that people like to do is they'll actually go in and they'll put like an underscore in here. And what that allows us to do is have a very simple way to sort of separate the words and still let us read them through. Now, that's fine, particularly if you're working with data for the first time. From my mind, a lot of times what I prefer to do is simply cut it down to something that makes more sense to me. Now, I know it's murder and non-negligent manslaughter. Doesn't mean I have to click on that every single time. So one of the things that we'll do here is we'll actually take the time to make sure these names make sense. Now, variable 3 up here, this V3, and I'm going to click back to the data view, is empty. And in fact, if I scroll down, you can see that we have 52 rows of information, and not a single one of them has any information in regards to V3. Now what this is simply a formatting of the Excel table. The program, and this is something I'm going to say a lot, the program's stupid. It doesn't know that a blank row is unimportant. It's going to take everything in. Now in some ways that's good because it's easier for us to delete things afterwards and have a program making some decisions along the way that we may not agree with. So with a case like this, we can simply highlight this column, V3, and just hit the delete button, and it's gone. And now things here make a little bit more sense. Now in this example, we have the 50 states, including the District of Columbia, as well as Puerto Rico in the data set. And you can see that what we actually have as we scroll through are population and crime count information, as well as we go a little bit further down, you can see here variables 13 through 21 are going to be crime rate information. Now, while I can't have spaces over in the names, I can have spaces over in the labels. And this is why a lot of times when people are working with data like this, they will keep the labels even though the labels may be a reflection of what the name is. Now, for example, one of the reasons I feel very comfortable about removing most of the label from the murder and non-negligent manslaughter row is the fact that that information is still over here in the label. So with that in mind, I know I still have access to the information. And this is an important consideration for us to make as we move forward, ensuring we know exactly what it is that we're working with and what it is we're doing. Now, the last thing I want to just sort of wrap up with here is just starting to take a look at one of the simplest commands we have in SPSS, and one of the ones that we will run frequently, and we're going to look at many different iterations of this. It's to simply generate what we'll call a frequency table. Now, for the example we have here, we know that we're going to have quite a few of these frequencies are going to be very different from one another. A frequency table, as you may recall, is going to be simply a list of the common sets of values. In other words, how often does a particular score or value show up in our database? Now, since these are all counts and rates, they're probably all going to be individually very different from one another. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to switch back over to that general social survey data file. And one of the things you probably just noticed is that with SPSS, we can have multiple SPSS files open at the same time. Now, if they're particularly large, I'd recommend to save your work frequently and keep a few files open because SPSS is a bit of a memory hog. But let's run a frequency table and then we'll wrap things up here. I'm going to go up here to the top and make sure you're in data view. I'm going to click Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and then right there on that first option is called Frequencies. And you can see now you have a list of variables on the left-hand side. Now this list is replicating the variable view from our prior screen. It's going to follow the same order. It's going to have the same labels being listed. And by the way, if we don't like looking at the labels or we're less interested in the labels, we can right mouse click over here and tell it to display the names instead. So if we find that more helpful, we can do that. I'm going to leave it on the display labels for the moment. And by the way, that order, like we said before, is the default. That's the order that's in your data file. But if you right mouse click, you can see we can also sort it alphabetically, sort it by a measurement level. For the moment, let's leave it exactly where it is. And what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to take a look at two variables, race and sex. Now, I could, one at a time, highlight the variables here on the left, click them over, and I can always click them back. Or if I hold down the Shift key, I can highlight multiple variables at the same time and pull them over. And once I've done that, in this case, all I'm curious about are the frequency tables, and you can see down here at the bottom, it says Display Frequency Tables and the default tables, and the default is always to have this checked. We can simply say, OK. Now, it might seem like nothing's happened, but as I said before, this is the data table. This is the data file that we're seeing. It's not the analyses we're doing. If I want to see those frequency tables I just requested, I have to go to the output file. And you can see as we come down to the output file, let me scroll down here a little bit, you can see you're given a little bit of information. Two variables, each had 2,867 valid scores. 0 missing data. We come down here, we can see what's being reported out is the label of the variable, race of respondent, respondent sex, and we can see that the responses are white, black, or other for race, male or female for sex. Now, why this particular order? Well, this order was actually tied into the numeric values associated with the labels. And so very quickly, I just want to jump back to that data view. And if I go here to the variable view, you can see that when we talked about sex, we talked about sex, 1 was male and 2 was female. In terms of race, 1 was white, 2 was black, 3 was other. And when I go back to that output file, white, black, other, 1, 2, 3, male, female, 1, and 2. And by the way, if I were to run one more frequency table here, and this time I'm going to bring over age. Now I'm going to kick these two back over to the left because otherwise it's just going to repeat them again. In this case, we have age of respondent, which is the only ratio level variable we have in this analysis. I say OK. And you can see the same logic is here. 2,800, and this time only 57 valid scores. 10 of them are missing. And you can see that the responses are in a numeric order going from lowest to highest. We had 7 people who were 18 years of age. And scrolling all the way down, we have 22 people who fall into that 89 or older grouping. So this is just sort of a preliminary way that we can start working with the software program and starting some of the simplest ways that we can become comfortable with it. Now, all we've really covered today is opening files and navigating our way around a little bit, but this is going to be something that you're repeatedly going to have to do. And as we move forward in the class and we start talking about conducting hypothesis tests, you're going to find that regardless of what more advanced statistics we want to run, we almost always have to start every type of analysis with some of these sort of very simple frequency and where we're going to go next, which is going to be some of our descriptive statistics. All right, that's everything I wanted to cover for this first presentation. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.